In other words, what Aristotle is saying is that the knowledge of an art of speeches is absolutely to be reserved only for a kind of aristocratic class, which in the Aristotelian sense always and only means a very virtuous class. But notice especially he's only speaking of the youth. And this returns to the motif of what I had mentioned previously in the Gorgias with relationship to Plato's Republic. The diffusion of technology into political community is especially seductive of the youth, and that's what can make it so absolutely dangerous. And so what we're seeing here with Plato and Aristotle is that the youth have always and everywhere been the most vulnerable to advances in technology and the consequences of that technology towards their education in virtue. What education in virtue means for Plato and for Aristotle is the shaping or the molding, the forging of the passions in the soul with that which is most beautiful in the soul, namely mind, because anything short of that flatly does not distinguish man from the other animals. And that is so important and timeless. But as things stand, speeches, or logoi, appear to have the capacity to exhort and to incite those youth who have at their disposal noble or beautiful leisure, and to make someone who has a well-born character and is truly a lover of what is beautiful receptive to virtue. So let's be sure that we understand what has been said there. Aristotle has told us speeches or logoi, or we could say the art of speeches, which is to say technology, appear, which is to say that they seem to have the capacity to exhort and to incite those youth who have time at their disposal for noble leisure, and they, the speeches, seem to have the capacity to make someone who has a well-born character, in other words, a well-born ethics, and who is also truly a lover of the beautiful, receptive to virtue. So the speeches seem to have the capacity to make the best of the youth receptive to virtue. However, speeches, or logoi, are incapable of exhorting the many to beauty and goodness, for the many are not naturally obedient to the governance supplied by a sense of shame. The word that's being translated as shame there is eidos, which could just as easily be translated as reverence or awe or respect. And so the many are not naturally obedient to the governance supplied by a sense of awe or reverence or respect, but rather they're naturally obedient to governance that is supplied by fear. And they do not naturally abstain from base things because of the shamefulness involved. For since they live by passion, in other words, no sign of logos, no sign of mind, they pursue the pleasures that are theirs together with what gives rise to those pleasures, and they avoid opposing pains. And here's the most important line for us, and possibly the most important line simply. As for what is beautiful and truly pleasant, they do not have even a conception of it because they've never tasted it. And then with his own rhetorical flair, Aristotle asks, so what speech or logos might reform people of this sort? And then he immediately answers it and he says, for it's not possible to alter by means of speech or logos what has long been enforced by their characters, which is to say their ethics. And then Aristotle provides his very grim conclusion. He says, but perhaps it is a desirable enough thing if, when everything through which we are held to become decent is present, we might at least have some share in virtue. In other words, what Aristotle is saying, his grim conclusion, is that to expect more of reason, which is to say more of mind, in political community as such, which is to say in politics, that itself is unreasonable. And perhaps the most that we can hope for is to at least strive to have everything present that would make people virtuous. Because at least in that case, everyone at least has the possibility of sharing, or we could say approximating virtue, because it's publicly known that that's the right thing to do. That is a very grim assessment. But notice just how thoroughly it is grounded in what we could refer to as a very deep psychological understanding of human nature. Namely, we as humans are simply predisposed to always being in the grip of pleasure. And that is absolutely not in and of itself something bad. Because as we've just seen, Aristotle, just as we're seeing with Plato, Socrates, and the Gorgias, is making the case that what is most pleasurable is that which is most beautiful, and that which is most beautiful is that which most separates man from all the other creatures. In other words, mind as it issues in logos, striving to know the natures of things, and the most important things, the best things, are the virtues. But the problem is that most people simply have no conception of what is properly beautiful. And what Aristotle has told us is that speech has the potential to induce in the souls of some people a receptivity to the virtuous life, but it's the many. And we always have to keep in mind that a significant portion of the many might very well be a significant portion of the youth. But the many have no conception whatsoever of the beautiful. And remember, Aristotle is talking about the Greek polis. These things were small. And so just imagine what he would say about our current nation states. Aristotle spells out in a way that we don't see in Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias, just how foundational the beautiful is with regard to speeches, which is to say logoi, and their relationship to actions, deeds, praxis, in making citizens virtuous.